Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. I think I can still say Happy New Year, so I'm going to say Happy New Year. My name's Douglas Northrup. I am this year the acting director of the Weiser Center for Europe and Eurasia. In my day job, I'm a professor of history and Middle East studies here. And I'm really pleased to welcome all of you to our kickoff event for 2026, which is Dr. Danielle Leavitt. We're very proud to have as our WCEE Postdoctoral Fellow in Ukrainian Studies for 2 years, actually. Before I say just something about Danielle, I wanted to say a word about a couple of upcoming events. If you're not already on our mailing list, please sign the sheet outside the door. We have just a couple of them here. One of our professional development fellows, Driar Elshani from Kosovo, will be giving a talk about AI, both in general and in the Balkans. That's January 26th. That'll be in this room. We also have a film series coming up in February. This is 3 films, Ukrainian films. 2 of them are at the State Theater, and 1 is on the 10th floor here. These are the dates. They include panel discussions after the first and the third films, and we hope all of you will make a point of coming for those events. And that brings me back to our main event for today. Danielle Leavitt is a historian of modern Ukraine, also of the Soviet Union, with a particular interest in Russian-Ukrainian relations, as well as the complicated histories of human age, generation and the formation of generations, gender in that part of the world. She received a PhD from Harvard in 2023, and after that spent 2 years as a postdoctoral fellow at Harvard's Ukrainian Research Institute. Much of her scholarly work, including the parts you probably won't hear as much about today, examine the process of generation making and human age and the study of human age in the Soviet Union, in which she inserts the stories of a variety of underrepresented peoples, especially the elderly and women, into all sorts of consequential debates about Soviet life, so-called stagnation, cultural life, all the way up to and through the Soviet collapse and beyond, the history of post-Soviet economic and political development, and she engages questions that range from the history of hairdressing to the Russo-Ukrainian War. So this is all designed to point you to her being with us for the next 2 years to explore all of these topics in the classroom as well as here in talks like tonight. The Russo-Ukrainian War, that of course is what brings us together this evening. Dr. Leavitt's first book, it's nice to be able to say that, right? By the Second Spring, 7 Lives in 1 Year of the War in Ukraine, was published a few months ago by Farrar, Straus, and Giroux. It charts the lives of 7 Ukrainians through the first year of Russia's full-scale war in Ukraine, based on a unique set, I would say, of online diaries as well as repeated conversations, intimate interviews. Leavitt is able to contextualize her 7 main subjects in Ukrainian society and uses them as a window to open a study of its predicaments and to show readers a rigorous but accessible history of Ukraine, the Soviet Union, its collapse, and Russia's historical relationship with its neighbors. With that out of the way, I will turn the podium over to her. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Dr. Danielle Leavitt.
Thank you so much, Doug, for such a kind introduction, and thank you so much to all of you for being here on such a warm evening when you could be walking outside. I'm so grateful to the Weiser Center for hosting me as a postdoc. It's been such a warm and welcoming intellectual environment, and I'm grateful to be invited to speak here tonight. Thank you so much for the opportunity. I'll begin tonight with a diary entry. It's written by a woman named Yulia. And when I first read this diary entry, it kept me awake on the other side of the world. April 8th, 2022. I heard a whistle above my head. I managed to look into the sky, realizing that it was the sound of an approaching projectile. Not knowing where to hide, I decided to move under a grove of pine trees. And then there was an explosion, like the sound of a whip, only multiplied 100 times. I was pushed by an explosive wave in the back and hit in my legs. I fell face down on a bench where two elderly women were sitting. One of them was wounded in the head, and her blood splashed on my face. We managed to look into each other's eyes. We were both horrified. I tried to crawl a little lower, covering my head with my hands, already realizing that there was a problem with my legs. She went on. There was dead silence for a few seconds. I tried to sit up and saw that my legs were broken into kasha, porridge. I saw my bones and yellow marrow mixed with meat and blood. I tried to shout help. I wanted to ask for a scarf or something with which to tie my legs and stop at least minimally the bleeding. But I realized that there is no one to help. Raising my head a little, I saw that the people standing and sitting opposite me were also covered in blood. Everyone who was near the volunteer tea stand was dead. Then a terrible howling began, the screaming of those who saw their loved ones dead and wounded. Remembering this sound, she wrote, is harder than experiencing the physical pain. After reading her account, I felt physically ill, like I needed to throw up. I kept reading it again and again, over and over. It was as though I could hear this woman's voice, as though she were in the room with me, even though she was 10,000 miles away. It was this entry, Yulia's diary, that ultimately led me to write this book and why I'm here with you today. What happened is this. A couple of months after Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, I was given unique access to a set of diaries kept online by Ukrainians in real time. I grew up in Ukraine and was reading basically everything I could find that was coming out of Ukraine. I had a compulsive, insatiable need to consume all information I could coming from Ukraine. But the diaries stunned me. They were staggering and unguarded and extremely insightful. They were different than anything I was reading. In the previous few months, I had grown frustrated by the portrayals of Ukrainians that I was reading in news media and reportage. These portrayals were either desperate war people or nearly superhuman heroes, and neither description felt entirely accurate. And as a whole, these portrayals had a flattening effect. And this bothered me because this was the moment the world was really coming to know Ukraine, and it was essentially becoming a caricature. I was finishing my PhD at the time and was neck deep in research and writing for my dissertation. But as I read accounts like Yulia's and watched them unfold over the course of that summer, becoming invested in how certain people fared and how their accounts developed, I felt a growing conviction that these stories mattered, that they were somehow essential to understanding the war itself. In their words, perhaps, was a power to shape how those outside Ukraine might come to understand this war. I started to sense that perhaps there was a book inside their diaries, and that maybe that book could have influence in how people came to understand Ukrainians. I contacted several diarists and asked if I could follow them over time. To my surprise, many agreed, all of them agreed, many more than I could feasibly manage to interview. In the end, Yulia and 6 others allowed me to correspond with them through the first and second years of this war. For many months, we exchanged thousands and thousands of text messages, voice memos, photos, videos, and even packages. From all of those exchanges came my book, By the Second Spring, 7 Lives and 1 Year of the War in Ukraine, which offers an intimate portrait of the lives of 7 ordinary people caught up in the most extraordinary circumstances. I want to pause briefly on method, because this project unfolded under conditions that resist so many of our usual historical categories. This work is based on sustained longitudinal correspondence with people living through an ongoing war. Unlike retrospective oral history, much of these exchanges took place in real time, without the interpretive distance that often allows meaning to settle. The people I write about were largely not reflecting back on an experience. They were inside of the experience. That made the project both extremely rich and provided some constraints. It limited in certain ways what I felt I could ethically ask, when I could press, and when my interlocutor's silence had to be respected. Additionally, the stories of these 7 people reach readers through layers of mediation. For example, our correspondence took place in either Ukrainian or Russian. I deferred to my interlocutors on language, with one exception, which was in English. But in addition to language, their accounts were often written from inside moments of shock or frustration, or on sleepless nights, or as my subjects were managing countless other responsibilities and predicaments. Translation here is not simply technical, it's also interpretive. So I treat repetition, fragmentation, and interruption not as flaws in this archive, but as historically meaningful features of it. Finally, I think what largely separates this project from a classically academic work is that I was never a detached observer. I was an interlocutor myself, present over months and years, and implicated in the production of the archive itself. I found very early on that my interlocutors perceived what we were doing as not just sharing story, but developing a relationship. They wanted to know about me too, and as I shared reciprocally my perspectives and experiences, they were more willing to share openly too. In the end, ordinary exchanges about children, including my children, or about daily routines, including my daily routines, were not digressions from the war, but were part of how people sustained personhood under conditions designed to erode it. By the end of this time together, my hope is that you will understand here and in reading the book how urgent and how significant it is that you, the audience, the reader, the listener, have a richer, more complex, more human understanding of this war. One that allows you a fuller capacity to read into the daily headlines and beyond them to something broader, deeper, more truthful, and more human. I want to introduce you to a man named Vitaly. I begin my book with Vitaly. Soon after he was born, the Soviet Housing Administration assigned his family a 3-room apartment, an unusually cushy reward for his father's work constructing their small town, Borodyanka, 30 miles northwest of Kiev. In the 1970s and early 80s, as the town expanded to serve a large excavator manufacturing factory, Vitaly's father helped build much of its central street. A topographer by trade, he surveyed land, mapped elevations, and passed his plans to architects and builders who would cover the terrain with 9-story concrete apartment blocks. The apartments followed a standard Brezhnev-era layout: a narrow corridor, separate toilet and shower, a small square kitchen with an enclosed balcony. From those balconies, residents overlooked shared courtyards with benches, concrete flower pots, and playgrounds, hidden from the street, but the vibrant hub of those small universes. It was in such a courtyard that Vitaly began to understand the world. Here you can see him near such a courtyard. He learned to read in a ground floor kindergarten. He played soccer with his best friend Serhiy while waiting for their parents to come home from work, and fell in love platonically and enduringly with a studious neighbor girl named Natalka, who tutored him when he struggled in school. 40 years later, Vitaly would tell me, "I trust her more than I trust myself." When Natalka's baby brother Artem was born, Vitaly doted on him, a performance that became genuine affection eventually. Artem grew into a bright-eyed tag-along, the darling of the courtyard. The Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, but the courtyard remained, and all the children who first saw the world from that small plot of land grew up. Vitaly, Serhiy, Natalka, Artem went away to school or did their military service, found spouses, picked up hobbies, had children, got divorced, and watched their own children grow up in identical courtyards. They all remained friends, and for 40 years, they trod across the worn path from the street to their apartments, passing through that common space where Vitaly's mother became an old woman, and where other children made their first best friends and learned to fight and swear and forgive, all of them crisscrossing through time and space, sharing that place once constructed by Vitaly's dad, where the complex spectrum of human life and love and loss took form. Coming of age in the 1990s shaped Vitaly deeply. For his generation, McDonald's, Nirvana, and acid-wash jeans made the West synonymous with cool. Despite inflation and instability, young people rejected Soviet ideology in favor of a chaotic market capitalism. American images appeared everywhere. Disney posters, Sylvester Stallone, new coffee shops and pizzerias. In Kiev, A taxi driver once pointed out the basement cafe that had housed the city's first pizzeria in the late 1980s, and everyone who knew anything about being cool wanted to spend even just a few minutes taking in what they imagined were the smells and tastes of the United States. Vitaly dressed the part. In one mid-2000s photo he sent me, he stands on the banks of the Dnipro River wearing shorts with the American flag, an NBA shirt over an NBA shirt emblazoned with the New York City skyline, a Yankees cap, and flip-flops. He exuded a distinctive Eastern European machismo. He posed in photos with this serious, unflinching expression, not happy, not sad, unquestionably alpha. And yet, at moments, a tenderness peeked through his tough exterior. He loved to draw. He sometimes recited poetry. He wore his heart on his sleeve, pining on occasion for Natalka, who moved with her children to the United States in 2015. As a young man in the 1990s, Vitaly had developed two dreams: to own his own coffee shop and to someday see the Statue of Liberty. He was 16 when the USSR collapsed. Like many Ukrainians, his national identity was still in formation, but he somehow knew he was not Russian. As a child, he pretended to ride horses like a Zaporizhian Cossack, something no one taught him to do, but which gave shape to a feeling of apartness. He grew up speaking Russian, though Ukrainian, with his mother and grandparents. The nuclear disaster at Chernobyl in 1986 sharpened this sense. When Vitaly was 11, evacuees flooded Borodyanka in the middle of the night. His new friends never returned home, and Vitaly, over time, came to understand that their villages were all dead. Over time, the disaster's effects became visible in his own body, too. By the time he was 40 years old, most of his teeth had fallen out. Naturally scrappy and prone to buck authority, Vitaly was made for 1990s Ukraine, where those with aggressive spirits figured out how to survive and make the new system work in their favor. He married young, had 2 sons, got divorced. He loved the boys, though he was not always present. He tried to be there for them, even when survival left him stretched thin. He saw life as a boxing match he intended to win. In 2005, he watched Cinderella Man, a movie about an obscure working-class boxer during the Great Depression who went on to become the world heavyweight champion. And he walked out of the theater transformed. It's still his favorite movie. During the difficult 90s, he served his mandatory time in the Ukrainian army, worked in construction as a welder, and for several years in a sawmill. But in the early 2000s, he wanted to try to work for himself, be his own man. He didn't have any money to start anything, so he began collecting trash to sell, scavenging through old buildings and junkyards, taking broken plastic from window frames, rusted out elevator parts, stairway railings from abandoned buildings. He broke the garbage down into different piles, one for hard plastic, one for metal, one for softer plastic, like packaging and plastic bottles, and one for paper. There was a lot of paper, as people were throwing away Soviet books and manuals that had lost all relevance. Over time, as Vitaly collected garbage to recycle and salvaged old materials, he was not just surviving, but saving money. When Natalka moved to New York City in 2015, he decided he wasn't going to wait anymore. He would save all his money and open his coffee shop. In time, he'd make enough money to buy a ticket to the Big Apple and see the Statue of Liberty. By late 2021, it was finally time for his coffee shop. He rented a modest commercial space on the roundabout entrance to Borodyanka from Kiev, right next to his apartment building and courtyard. He budgeted and saved to get all the necessary appliances: a grill, a microwave, a refrigerator, and a small electric oven. But most of all, he coveted a professional-grade espresso machine, like the ones he imagined baristas using in professional New York cafes. Renting the machine would have been more fiscally responsible, but he allowed himself this one luxury after so many years of meticulous planning and saving. Although he was not much of a reader, Vitaly pored over the machine's instruction manual, meditating upon each of its features. His girlfriend sewed curtains and decorated the shop with fake flowers and coffee-themed wooden signs. He named the shop Coffee Break, and on February 1st, 2022, he opened to the public. Right on Highway E373, the same road that a few weeks later, a long convoy of Russian tanks would travel on their way to Kiev. Though rumors of war were everywhere in late February, just before Russia's invasion, Vitaly stayed focused on his coffee shop. Each morning around 6, he turned on the oven to bake croissants and brewed the coffee. When the rumors proved true, on the 24th, he tried to keep calm. He ordered refills of cups and lids and stocked up on coffee beans. Business was slow. People were scared, and although Borodyanka had so far been quiet, many were already fleeing or hiding in basement shelters. But Vitaly had no interest in leaving. On the 25th, with no customers, he backflushed the espresso machine, scrubbing out the grounds and flushing it with detergent. The next day, he washed the floors and organized the freezer. On the 27th, Russian tanks rolled into Borodyanka. For 2 days, he joined efforts to protect the town, and even after a Russian tank smashed the windows of a store across the street, seemingly for no reason at all, he kept brewing tea to distribute to people sheltering underground. On March 1st, while making coffee, Vitaly heard planes overhead. He ran into a cellar across the street where his mother, brother, sister-in-law, and their 4-year-old son were sheltering. The basement beneath their own building was too crowded, so they huddled in the neighboring cellar, sleepless, letting the child watch cartoons on a phone as tanks passed by. Through a small peephole, Vitaly watched as a plane dropped a small package onto his apartment complex across the street. The explosion slammed his face into the wall. When the dust settled, he realized the building was burning and that people were inside. His best friend, Serhiy, his neighbors, the children from his courtyard. Fearing another strike, they fled the cellar and ran to Artem's house in an unoccupied part of town. To get there, they had to cross a highway filled with tanks moving toward Kiev. Vitaly's brother led, Vitaly brought up the rear. Their mother, Tamara, in her 70s, ran despite her bad knees as gunfire cracked nearby. No one stopped. They reached Artem's neighborhood where friends gathered, and they made plans to evacuate. Walking west, they passed burned-out cars, shot-up buses, and columns of black smoke rising in the distance. One boy in their party carried a cat in his arms, and Vitaly noted that as they walked away, the cat did not meow once. As they left Borodyanka, Vitaly looked back. His apartment building no longer filled the skyline as it had his entire life. The coffee shop was gone too, crushed in the collapse. The kindergarten where he had learned to write his name was gone. The courtyard where he learned to play soccer and first fell in love had disappeared. Could the world continue to exist without that place? And even if it did, who was he in it? What kind of man is cleaning out his espresso machine on the first day of war? What was destroyed here was not only a town, but the infrastructures through which identity is reproduced. Courtyards, apartment blocks, small businesses, these are not incidental backdrops. They are material systems that sustain social life and memory over time. When war obliterates them, it does more than eliminate shelter or livelihood. It severs the frameworks through which people recognize themselves as continuous beings. Later, when the Kiev region was liberated, Vitaly returned to Borodyanka the very next day, and he began digging through the rubble compulsively, almost as though he were not able to govern himself. He spent days turning over pieces of debris through the night. It was a process he was familiar with from his recycling days, but this time he was searching for parts of himself. After several days of digging, he found something that he recognized. His old espresso machine. Vitaly's story demonstrates a truth in this war, and in every war, how an entire world can be leveled in minutes, home, history, memory. Yulia's story, the diary with which I began, reveals the same truth but on a human body. The way war devastates not only material places but people, bodies, and flesh. Their stories, side by side, press us to ask, what does it mean to begin again when everything familiar is reduced to rubble, when the rooms you grew up in no longer exist, or when your very body has been remade by violence? What does it mean to keep choosing life, to keep insisting on a future in the face of that kind of loss? This is Yulia, with whom I began my talk. Returning to her at the train station where the missile attack she wrote about occurred. For an interminable 10 seconds following the attack, Yulia stared at her legs, desperately considering what she should do. That something was terribly wrong was obvious, but her mind buzzed with another potential tragedy. Were her husband, Oleg, and daughter, Olya, alive? They had also been with her on the other side of the station. Finally, she said out loud the only thing that was self-evident. Legs, my legs. Realizing there was no one to help, she decided she should first try to make a tourniquet and apply it where her legs were hemorrhaging. After that, she would think further. Her tight jeans held in some pieces of her legs, but what wasn't contained by the jeans was now entirely detached from her body, covered in pine needles and dirt on the earth around her. She took off her sweater and pulled it tightly around her right leg, which was the most damaged. To slow the bleeding on the left leg, she removed her belt and tightened it around the wound. As she worked, she noticed that the middle finger of her left hand had also been torn off and hung on only by the skin. She could barely hear the phone in her pocket ringing. It was Olya, her daughter, and they were alive and desperate to find Yulia. "I am almost exactly where you left me," Yulia said, glimpsing Olya's pink jacket in the distance and waving her arms to catch Olya's attention. As Olya approached, her eyes opened wide as they focused on the pool of blood that Yulia lay in. Olya began shrieking and sobbing, but Yulia interrupted, knowing that they could not spare a single moment to succumb to their emotions. Olya understood and gathered herself before rushing to find Oleg. When they arrived, they slid Oleg's jacket under Yulia to lift her up. Oleg, Olya, and a nearby policeman dragged Yulia to their car, put her in the back seat, and sped to the nearest hospital. The windows and mirror on the passenger side were broken and dangling, occasionally shedding shards of glass onto the passengers. On the car ride to the hospital, Yulia was overwhelmed not by her pain, but by her thirst. She learned that the volume of blood she'd lost and was losing triggered the hormone system that regulates blood pressure and electrolyte balance, resulting in her central nervous system responding with a profound craving for water. "I wanted to drink so unbearably," she said, "as if I would die of thirst and not of my wounds." When they arrived at the hospital, the corridors were filled with the wounded. 60 people were killed at the Kramatorsk railway station that day, and more than 100 injured. They lined the hallways, and many lay in the middle of the floor, directly on the tiles. Frantic nurses and doctors stepped around bodies to get more bandages and towels. A trembling nurse tried to register Yulia by writing her data with a permanent marker directly on Yulia's shoulder. But she kept making mistakes because she was so nervous and crossing out what she had written. Yulia's mouth was so dry from blood loss that she could not clearly pronounce her last name. Yulia asked for water, just a sip, to moisten her mouth, knowing that they probably would not give it to her because she would soon receive anesthesia and they would not want her to vomit. She begged for anesthesia, but there was still someone else ahead of her to be seen by the anesthesiologist, a child, a young girl. She died while Yulia waited. Yulia could still move the toes of her left foot, and though she was barely conscious, she knew that she was the only one who could advocate for that leg. Before getting anesthesia, she told the nurses and doctors near her that she could move her toes, that there was still hope for that leg, and asked them to try to save it if they could. While Yulia was in the operating room, Oleg helped to unload other wounded people from the ambulances. Many were already dead. Yulia lost enough blood that the anesthesiologist thought that that might kill her. During the operation, doctors gave Yulia a blood transfusion and worked to try to manage her injuries. Facing hallways of wailing patients, the small crew of provincial surgeons did away with specialization. The attending surgeon performed whatever surgery was needed, even if she had only read about it in a book. They focused their efforts on stopping bleeding, sewing up what could be patched, and cutting off what was hopeless. For more specialized work, Yulia would need to go to a larger hospital with more resources. Out of surgery, nurses made sure she was clean and bandaged well. They gave her opioids to manage the pain. After several hours in observation, the small hospital in Kramatorsk arranged for her immediate transfer to Dnipro, a major city 5 hours to the west with a large hospital. There, a team of doctors waited for Yulia. What might take some time to sink in for Oleg and the girls was already clear to Yulia. Everything was different now. They would not be going home together for a long time. Yulia asked Oleg to please return first to Konstantinovka before meeting her in Dnipro. He would secure their house, make sure the animals were okay, take the dog, talk with the neighbors, and ensure that they could care for the garden and birds. They would need to collect the girls' school books, some clothing, and all their toiletries. But this was not a vacation. Oleg was to board up the windows, turn off the water, lock all the doors with padlocks, remove everything valuable, and retrieve their important documents in case, God forbid, some unfriendly soldier tried to make their home his own. Yulia had one other request. Could Oleg please bring one of the flower pots filled with their soil? Yulia spent all of that summer in the hospital and later most of the fall in bed or in a wheelchair attached to an external fixator on her remaining leg, which was extremely uncomfortable. She suffered phantom pains and for several months fell into a deep depression. And yet, in general, Yulia had been able to manage her emotional and psychological distress remarkably well. She had been on an antidepressant since leaving the hospital, which had helped her immensely. She was calm and gentle by nature, and while she didn't shy away from difficult topics, she regularly said things like, "The most important thing in such difficult situations is not to give in to despair, or you can choose the passive oppression of your body and soul, or you can work on yourself, correct your body and thoughts from negative to positive. I allow myself to cry sometimes, but not for long." She said to me many times, unironically, that her favorite book was Pollyanna. Of all my interlocutors, Yulia wanted to know the most about me. She asked me often about myself, about my opinions, my daily life. I could tell she grew tired of talking about the war, and she often changed the subject to other aspects of life she enjoyed: parenting, crafting, home decorating, gardening. I often sent her photos and videos of my children. Once she gave me advice on how to keep them from drawing all over our apartment walls, and we engaged in a conversation for some time about the hazards and delights of toddlers, until suddenly it stopped. She went silent for some time, though I could see that she had seen my messages. When she returned to our conversation after several days, we didn't talk about children drawing on walls or jumping on furniture. Konstantinivka was being shelled again, which was no longer news in itself, but this time the activity was so near their home that all the windows in their gazebo were shattered, and one of their birds had been killed by a shell fragment. A week or so later, Yulia wanted to talk about other things again, but hanging over our conversation was the understanding that we lived in different worlds, that she had been touched by war and I had not. Once she mentioned that in their town, just a few kilometers from the center of the carnage, some people still sold pumpkins from their garden at an outdoor market. When a building on the market street was shelled, those farmers helped to clean up the mess and then went back to work. When the market itself was shelled, they found a new place to sell their pumpkins. Despite the danger, they tried to live an ordinary life. And I sensed this was what she did in our conversations too. In the second week of the new year, Yulia was fitted for a prosthetic leg in the rehabilitation hospital in Dnipro. What remained of her left limb was measured to create a mold made out of plaster and fiberglass bandages. From the mold, the manufacturer created a positive model. In several weeks, the prosthetic template would be ready for a fitting. Once it arrived, she'd try it on, putting pressure on the leg stump inside the prosthetic to see how it fit. Afterward, doctors could make a few more alterations to ensure it was comfortable, and then she would begin rehabilitation therapy in earnest. Later, Yulia sent me a video of her rehabilitation work. Oleg grinned in the mirror while she held on to parallel handrails and began the process of relearning how to walk, taking very short steps, heel to toe. The therapists promised that over time, once she was walking in everyday situations, she would develop the skills to navigate stairs, curbs, uneven surfaces, and hills. Over time, she would again walk confidently with long strides. Her life would never be as it was, but with a new prosthetic leg, she would be able to bend, kneel, and crouch. Perhaps someday, she dreamed, she would return alive to her native Donbass and plant the acorns she had gathered in Dnipro. Maybe by then, the sky would be safe and they would someday grow into tall, sturdy oaks. Yulia and Vitaly and the 5 other individuals who've shared their lives in my book demonstrate that behind every headline we read about Ukraine are millions of Ukrainians who, like Yulia and Vitaly, are the people who have been living through and waging the war we speak of, enduring its unrelenting precarity and grappling with catastrophes as they arise daily and randomly. If we fail to account for lives like theirs, we do not merely misunderstand this war. We inherit analytical habits that privilege abstraction over lived experience. To speak only in terms of strategy or territory is to create a narrow and incomplete historical vision. Writing a people-centered history of any era, but especially the present, means privileging human experience over power. The stakes here are not only moral, but epistemic. How this war is written determines what kind of knowledge it produces. And I am invested in knowing what it looks like and feels like to live in a brutal modern war and to do so humanely. If my work here does anything, I hope it simply honors those regular, easily forgotten people who are showing us how to do just that. Thank you.
We have time for questions. The audience and Danielle will call on them herself.
Take it away. Yuri.
Hello everyone. My name is Yuri Kaparurin and I'm a former Wildlife Center fellow, Scores at Risk program, and currently a fellow at the new created Royal Warburg Institute at the University of Michigan. So first of all, thank you for this. I mean, it's not maybe correct word, it's a great job, even if it is a great job, but thank you for this work, what you did. And I have a question about maybe backside of the work process. When you looking for your interviewers, people who will record the stories, are you experienced maybe a situation when people refused your offer to talk, or maybe recalled their decision to accept your offer? Because During the first week or first month during the full-scale invasion, many people who experienced different kinds of brutality from Russian troops, they were really open to recall their experience, because they thought even they will tell the world what's going on, it will be stopped very soon. But it was not stopped in weeks, months, even the years until today. And many people simply stuck with this, and many decided even recall back their testimonies from some oral history projects. So can you tell a bit more about this side of your work, if you some kind had such experience?
Yeah. You know, I think one of the reasons, so to answer shortly, no one refused actually, and no one recalled. Once I began interviewing people, no one said, actually, no, I don't want to participate. I think one of the reasons for that is when we began, we were already like 6 months into war, and so people had had a little bit of time already to kind of think about the previous 6 months. So the first 6 months of war were, in the book, all retrospective. The next 6 months were more or less in real time when I was interviewing them. One of the things that surprised me most, and one of the things that I was looking for most in the people that I chose to interview, was a sense of eagerness to share their story. That was probably the most critical, I guess, qualification for me. I went through a period of kind of auditioning characters, if I can say that. There were lots of people that wanted to participate because people were very eager to share their stories. I think it was in some ways helpful for people to have this interlocutor consistently engaging with them and asking them questions. And if I can, I mean, ideally, I hope that it was maybe a little bit helpful for these people. In the best possible outcome, I hope that I could have provided them something that, was helpful for them. Maybe it was, maybe it wasn't. I like to think that maybe it was helpful for them to talk with me. But a lot of people, I think, were just interested in being heard by someone, and so they were anxious to participate. But I needed a few things in order for this book to work. The first thing that I needed was for them to be really motivated to tell their story. If they were kind of like, I don't really want to, then I can't make them tell their story. The second thing that I needed was a type of articulateness. I needed them to be very expressive because I can't put words in their mouth. I can't make up narrative for them. If it was like pulling teeth to get them to, speak verbosely, then it would be difficult to write their stories. This is why I almost immediately knew that I wanted to have Vitaly in the book, because he was just ready to tell me everything. As soon as I started messaging with him, he was like, oh, you want to know something? I will let you know. And I will you want to hear about my family? Let me tell you about my family. And he just had so much to tell me and didn't hold back on anything. And it was so fun to talk to him. The last thing that I needed was, I was trying to, in the end, I chose to prioritize I needed Ukrainians that represented more or less a modern cross-section of Ukrainian society. I wanted someone from the Kiev region. I needed someone from the Donetsk region or the Donbass. I needed someone from southern Ukraine, someone who was in a rural environment, old, young, highly educated, less educated. I needed to kind of, fill out these profiles. And so in the end, I ended up prioritizing profile over story. And that's kind of an interesting choice. But the truth is, every Ukrainian has, or a huge percentage of people living in Ukraine have an incredible story. I mean, like, most Ukrainians could have like a movie made about them. And I kind of knew that I could find amazing stories everywhere I went if I was willing to ask good questions and if I could get people to open up. But I really needed to find people who fit specific profiles because I needed to use their stories as a way to access the past, like access Ukrainian history. Because one of the things that I was trying to do in this book was tether Ukrainian history to real people's lives. So, for example, I didn't talk about it much in this talk because I was, talking about writing a people-centered history. But one of the things that I do in the book is take these kind of historical diversions where I explore the collapse of the Soviet Union or the 1990s or, other aspects of Ukraine's history vis-a-vis each of these subjects. And I think that's a helpful way for non-expert audiences to become familiarized with Ukraine's history. Yeah, Jeff.
Maybe I'll ask you to build upon what you were just talking about. I mean, the stories that you told, that they're harrowing stories and terrible stories of war, but they're stories that could take place in any war. What is it, or is there anything particularly in, the socio-political, economic sphere that renders these stories particularly Ukrainian, or how do you, other than you said you tell the story, the history of Ukraine through narrative diversions, but how do their experiences tell that story, other than just generic war?
Well, I think I think like contextually, everything about their lives makes them uniquely Ukrainian. Nothing about their experiences in war makes them Ukrainian. So I guess I wasn't trying to write the book as a way of showing what it looks like to be uniquely Ukrainian in this Ukrainian war. I was trying to show what it looks like to be a human being living in any war, right? And use that as a way to kind of sneakily explore Ukrainian history. Yeah.
I was wondering, before this book was published, if you had these people read through what was written, and if so, were there ever instances where maybe they were like, oh, maybe change that, but then would that kind of compromise the live, I don't know, not retrospective but live experience?
This is something that I really suffered over, this predicament, because I wanted the book to be as accurate and factual as humanly possible. And at the same time, I did not want the book to be autobiographical at all. I did not want these Ukrainian people to be writing their own stories. That was never the point. I was writing their stories as an outside observer. That changes the genre kind of fundamentally. And so this was tricky because I knew that I would get things wrong. You know, all of these messages, I'd be like interpreting things incorrectly or getting details wrong or messing something up here and there. And so I spent a lot of time, months, kind of going through the manuscript, picking out details, and just compiling lists of details from each subject that I would then send them and say, can you fact check each of these details and tell me, is this correct? Did you go to the lake with your husband at this time? Or was so-and-so born then? Or was this when so-and-so went to the war or whatever? So I could try to make sure that the timelines were all totally accurate, that the emotions were totally accurate or whatever. That being said, I'm sure I still got stuff wrong. And that's kind of, you know, uncomfortable. I don't like that feeling, but I think that's the reality of how a book like this works. That being said, I think, you know, sometimes I wonder. So all of my interlocutors have the book, and several of them have read it or have begun reading it. You know, it's not translated into Ukrainian, and so I wonder how much they've been able to engage with it, because several of them don't read English. But sometimes I wonder how much of themselves they'll recognize in their stories. You know, when someone has like a portrait painted of them, it sometimes like looks like their first cousin or something. I wonder if they'll feel like that. But, you know, I hope that they can see themselves in it. And aspirationally, I hope that maybe it sheds light on their story in a way that is insightful for them. Yeah.
I think my questions may be twofold, so sorry about that ahead of time. The first one, with your interlocutors, if any of them, you kind of touched on it a little bit, that, you know, after the fall of the Soviet Union, there was a developing sense of what Ukrainian identity was. With any of them prior to the 2022 invasion, were there any that said that their identity was still in the process of developing, and then said, you know, when the invasion happened, it was then solidified? And I guess second, any of them, you know, I imagine some of them had relations with people in Russia or had done business across the border, or, you know, having spoken Russian, had connections to Russia, and yeah, what was their description of the sense of betrayal or shock at when they attacked? Was that something that they were already grappling with from the 2014 invasion, or is that new? Or yeah, I'm just curious about that. Yeah,
so this burgeoning sense of Ukrainian identity is, I mean, it really is a spectrum, kind of a gradient for many Ukrainians, but there's kind of different moments of rupture, you could say. 1991 is a big one, 2014 is a big one, 2022 is an enormous one. And lots of Ukrainians, I would say for a lot of Ukrainians, 2022 is just like a nail in the coffin for Ukrainians who'd kind of been holding out on kind of resisting, you know, for example, transitioning to speaking Ukrainian. Interestingly, one of my interlocutors switched from Russian to Ukrainian midway through our interview process, or she would speak Russian in our conversations. Like, she felt more comfortable speaking Russian in our conversations, but all of her social media posts were all in Ukrainian. And so 2022 was a huge moment of kind of national awakening for a lot of people. And in terms of kind of the relational ruptures, I mean, this was profound. In 2014, it was significant, obviously, but in 2022, I don't think you can overstate how significantly the invasion has severed relational ties familially. I mean, already a lot of business ties had been severed in 2014. There were no longer direct flights, for example, between Russia and Ukraine beginning in 2014 because you couldn't fly safely across the Donbass. But, and, you know, they didn't trade very easily anymore. But so a lot of business ties had already been severed, but family ties have become extremely tense. A lot of people, especially in southeastern Ukraine, when the full-scale invasion started, they left to Russia, which caused a lot of Ukrainians left to Russia as opposed to leaving to Poland or Eastern Europe, and that caused a lot of familial discord. I think it will take many generations for families to heal. Yeah.
Thanks.
Not a question, but I just want to thank you for doing what you've done. Been sitting here kind of a wreck lately.
Thank you.
I can imagine it's so much harder to tell these stories about people you've come to know and love over this time. And even for us, that it's so hard to hear. They're so raw and intimate, and so I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Their stories are powerful, your writing's powerful, but I love that photograph. Can you tell me if there's any special story in your choice to use it? I'm wondering where this bridge is, if it's your photograph, and what you like best about it. There's so many different things you can focus on.
Yeah, it's a terrific cover. I had absolutely no hand in it, but they did a great job with it. I do know a little bit about it, though. It's a bridge in the Donetsk region. It's in a small village crossing a relatively small river. The bridge was bombed in the first few months of the war. These are residents of that small village who are crossing the bridge to go to like a pickup point to get bread. Sometime in, I think, like April or May of the first spring of war. Yeah. It's a great image, though. It's poignant. They're like rising. You don't know exactly where they're going.
Right. You don't know what's beyond the debris. The dog.
The dog. Yeah. It's so thoughtful. It's terrific. Thank you. Yeah.
Are you still corresponding with people in the book, and how have their attitudes maybe changed since Zelensky's meeting in the Oval Office?
I am still corresponding with most of them. Some of them, our correspondence is kind of tapered off, but a lot of them we still talk pretty regularly, especially Yulia. You know, they have a pretty complex relationship with Zelensky and with Trump. And many Ukrainians have a complex relationship with both of those figures, and it's not necessarily kind of definitively anti-Trump or definitively pro-Trump, and that's you know, they fall on both sides, and so all my interlocutors included, they come from all parts of Ukraine, and they represent diverse political persuasions. That's why I picked them. And so they think very different things, all of them. And how they respond to these men is very different. And that's been really interesting to manage on our messages. Yeah.
Did you eventually meet any of these people in person? And what was that like?
I've never met them in person, except for one of them who I've actually known since I was a kid. Yeah. I hope to meet them someday in person. And I imagine it'll be interesting. Yeah. Yeah.
kind of build off the question, I was wondering how their attitudes might have changed since you last talked to them, given the scales of which, like the attacks, the long waves of drones and the nighttime raids. I'm wondering how that's kind of reflected in your conversations with them.
Yeah. Well, I don't think any of them thought the war would still be going on. And I think they are so disillusioned with the way that it's been handled and with the intensification of the artillery assaults and the fact that there really is no end in sight, I think, despite the kind of rhetoric around peace deals and stuff. Yulia especially has, her life has, it's hard to talk about this because the book is so, the book kind of occupies this really weird space in literature, which is so many books about war come into being long after a war has ended. And so readers approach the book kind of already with a sense of closure, and you anticipate, you're going to encounter this hard story, but you know the war's over and the person is probably already dead for 60 years, but that's not the case in this book. You read the book, you don't know if the person will die in the book or if they've died in the years since, and the war is still going on years later after the book has been published. And that's really unsettling when you pick up a book like this. I kind of wonder if, I wonder what that feels like as a reader. I know what it feels like as an author, but I know the end of the story and I know what's going on with all of my characters now. And so, for example, Yulia, I kind of gave you some synopsis of her story, that she gets this prosthetic leg and she dreams of being able to someday return home to her house, and her gazebo was hit with these shell fragments and they're scared as the front line approaches their home, and the front line indeed continues to approach their home, and their town is right next door to Chasiv Yar, which becomes the bloodiest center of the front line for a long time. And eventually, about a year ago, 11 months ago in February, Yulia wrote to me and told me that their home was completely destroyed in an attack. And this event was so demoralizing for Yulia that, 3 years after she loses her leg in a missile attack, she then loses her home. She's been displaced for so long. The duration of this loss is so demoralizing. And it's hard to, it's hard to keep rallying, So Yulia is very, every time I talk to Yulia, she has so much hope in Trump, that Trump can somehow get this done for Ukraine. And anyone who can end this war, it doesn't matter, give away half of Ukraine if they need to, And I think this is something that something that we don't hear in the United States a lot. And at the same time, there are so many other Ukrainians that understand that is prelude to a different war. And there are no easy answers in this. I don't envy anyone who has to make any of these decisions. But the bottom line is, they're all demoralized and very disillusioned.
to shed a little bit of light. Can you tell us a little bit about your next project?
Yeah, I mean, I'm still kind of figuring this out. I'm working a little bit on the siege of Mariupol, and developing a book, which will be a longer project about Soviet hair salons as a site of information exchange and subversion. Yeah. One more question, maybe? Yeah.
How do you think the main themes of the book would change if you were to write it in year 3 or 4? For example, one thing that kept coming to me is when I speak with my Ukrainian friends, I found that the war for them got strangely normalized, starting with year 2.
Yeah.
Where at first I heard from them, I was like, well, I'm not going to restaurants or movie theaters, etc. And then the narrative was, I just gotta live my life. And I always found it as an observer from a distance, it's extremely strange where there's a fully blown war going on, but at the same time people speak about, celebrations, going to restaurants, movies, parties, etc. This is just one sliver of that. Do any of the themes that you uncovered in the book, do you think they would change meaningfully in years 3 or 4?
Absolutely. Yeah. I feel like the first year of war is about survival and coping, and years 3 and 4 are absolutely new things. In fact, I feel like the first year was so much more intense, especially in terms of the actual artillery barrages. The attacks on energy infrastructure were so intense the first fall and winter. And year 2 was a lot calmer, actually. And then this year has been so much harder than years 2 and 3 probably were. I mean, I don't have statistics, and so I think there was this kind of sense of relative ease during those years. I don't know what a book like that would look like, but I think people developed all sorts of kind of normal life wartime rituals, how they live the good life during drone attacks, and it's really interesting. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you all for coming. Thank you for a terrific, thoughtful discussion. I wish that last question wasn't still appropriate. I mean, I think we all wish that wasn't, but we thank Danielle for offering such thoughtful insight into the first year of the war. As a reminder, something I said at the beginning, we have a whole Ukrainian film series coming up next month. I hope to see many of you there. Thank you all for coming.